Morning, how are we doing this morning? We're glad that you're here. Genesis 16 is where we're going to be this morning. Genesis 16. Glad you're here this morning in person or joining us online wherever you are around the world. And so just excited to open up God's Word with you this morning as we continue our series called The One Life Movement, a Domino Effect. I don't know what life was like for you in elementary, but my favorite part of the day was my packed lunch. Anyone else? Okay. All right, I loved lunchtime. All right, lunch was a big deal for me, and part of it was because I had the best snacks from my mom inside my lunch. A couple months ago, I was walking through Meijer with my oldest son, Malik, and we walked down the aisle that had all the little Debbie treats and hostess snacks. You know what I'm talking about? All right, so I have a picture to show you what you're seeing right now, and here's the truth. Like, I've had all of these. Everyone here, I've probably had, and I don't know what your favorite is, like with what your childhood was like when you grew up with Hostess treats and Little Debbie's, but for me, it was, the cupcakes and the ding-dongs and oatmeal cream pies and fudge rounds and even the Nutty Buddies. Like, everything was epically awesome. Now, here's the truth. My son's not had any of this. Not one bite. Right? And so some might call that good parenting, right? But for me, I know that my son is missing out. And so for him, he feels forgotten. He feels forgotten that no one in his life, that no one cares enough to help him share in the glory of Hostess cakes, right? And so what we did is we wanted me to take this picture so I could send it to Grandma, right? Hoping that Grandma would solve his greatest life problems, He feels forgotten. Question. Have you ever felt forgotten? Ever felt forgotten? Listen, we know that we are valuable when we're actually seen. And so I wonder this morning how many people in the room actually feel forgotten. You're forgotten in relationships, and you're forgotten in marriage, you feel. You're forgotten at work. You're forgotten in ways where you're misunderstood, or you've tapped out of life, and you're just not recognized, and no one acknowledges actually who you are. Your spouse might not see you. Your boss might not see you. No one is just really seeing you and paying attention to what's happening in your life. Listen, if you've ever felt forgotten in your life at any point, I want you to know something, that there's a God who sees. And there's a God who sees everything that you face. And when we're fully seen by Him, what we're going to see this morning is that it truly does change absolutely everything. Have you felt forgotten? This morning, we're going to look at comparing domino effects, right? Two different domino effects that will lead us down two different paths. And maybe you'll find yourself on one of these two. And we're going to pick it up in Genesis chapter 16. And here's the first comparison we're going to see is believing you're worthy or unworthy in God's eyes. Look at chapter 16 with me. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me.' But Abram said to Sarai, 'Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please.' And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her." So jumping back into the story of the life of Abram, and maybe it's your first time here, right? Where we started in Genesis 1, and we're kind of working our way through the story of what God is doing in His Word in the book of Genesis. And if you were with us last week, we saw that Abram experienced this incredible spiritual high. Have you ever had that in your life where you just feel like you're on the mountain of faith with the Lord, and God has come through and revealed Himself to you in clear ways, and it's like you're just feeling great? And Abram had that last week when God made a covenant with him, a a one-way covenant where God said, I'm going to go the distance for you. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make sure the promise that I'm guaranteeing you actually becomes reality. But now, this story actually turns the focus off Abram and turns it to his wife, Sarai. It makes me ask the question, do you think Abram ever took time to fill his wife in on what God has promised and said he would actually do? Because here's what we're going to see. Last week we saw this great man of faith. In fact, in chapter 15, verse 6, it says that he believed the Lord, and it was credited to him, it counted to him as actual righteousness. But now we're going to see this man fail miserably in his faith. Question, has your faith ever crumbled before? Where something so painful has invaded it and it's made your faith crumble to the ground? I just want you to know this. Like, if that's you, today you're going to find hope. You're going to find hope. And so in this story, we've already read it. Sarai's 75 years old. She's been living in the land of Canaan for 10 years. And so if you remember the story in Genesis 12, God appeared to Abram, called him out of idolatry, and said, I want you to come follow me. Now, here's the thing. Sarai was also a part of that. So she joined Abram in following this God that she didn't know, who called out to her husband. But notice the barrier that still exists in her life. The barrier is what? She has no children. She has no children. She's actually barren. So we have this woman who we saw in chapter 12 was blessed with incredible beauty, but she's also grieved with barrenness. Now here's the truth. In the context of the day of what's happening here, what they're going to suggest is actually part of the culture. It actually would have been okay for it to happen in the world, that things that happen in that world. And so here's the challenge for Sarai. Everything that's happening in the culture is about her being a mom. Everything in the culture is about her having children. You see, what the culture would say is that you are unworthy if you don't have a child. Right? You must have missing some kind of value in your life. You see, everything was tied to actually being a mom, and so everything falls apart in this culture if you were not a mom. And so humiliation would actually set in because she would not be able to have children, but she got to watch many other women actually have children. So here's what culture said. Culture said, Sarah, this is your fault that you actually don't have a child. Which then means, here's what the culture is saying. The culture is saying, your identity is found in being a mom. And if you can't fulfill that, you truly are unworthy. Which the message is this: just because culture might look down on you doesn't mean that God actually does. Do you realize that God's view of you has nothing to do with what culture says or thinks? Do you know that God doesn't actually care what culture says or thinks? That has no role in how God actually views you. And so Sarah's barren, and she's discouraged. And culture has communicated a message to her that's actually ungodly and actually not backed by the gospel at all. And so she's watched many births happen in this tribe that she's traveled with, wondering, is she ever going to have one? Is God ever going to come through in what he said he was actually going to do? And so what does Sarai do? She begins to scheme. Now, let me speak to a moment to all the women in the room. Maybe you're in a spot where you've wanted to have a child and you've been waiting for God to come through, and you've been praying and you've been pleading and you've been trusting God. God, we would love to be parents. I would love to be a mom. I just simply want you to know that God sees you. He sees you and he hears you. Right? Your prayers are not going unheard by him. Right? He hears and he sees, and he's for you, and he loves you deeply. Here we see Sarah, though, she begins to scheme. And here's the thing. The plan that she's going to suggest is actually the first biblical marriage of a triangle found in the Bible. Here's her plan. Abram, I want you to have a child with my servant Hagar. Now again, in the culture of the day, this is completely acceptable. Now let's back up. In Genesis chapter 2, when we saw God give the gift of marriage, what did God actually say? He says, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. In other words, marriage is between what? It's between one man and one woman. That's what Genesis 2 actually tells us. What did Genesis 2 say? Here's the point. God designed it, therefore God defines it. And while our culture loves to redesign what God has already designed, what we end up doing is just distorting all that God's actually declared as good. And so that means this: any marriage outside of a man and a woman, the Bible would declare sin. right? He declares it a sin. And it's not because God is holding out on us. It's simply because God knows what's best. It was his idea. It had mission behind it. He had a plan of why he gave the gift of marriage. And so it's his to complete, not ours to define. But that's not what's happening here, right? Last week, Abram attempted to manufacture God's promise in his life, and now we're going to see Sarah actually do the exact same thing. But anytime we scheme to produce a desired outcome that we want, that requires God's power and God's timing, how does that result? Listen, it's going to result in rejection, in anger, in hurt, in bitterness, in jealousy. All the things that we think make a good movie or a good book, those things are typically not fun in real life. Notice what it says in verse 2. It says, "And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go unto my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain a child or children by her.'" Did you catch the key word that she used? It's the word prevented. It's the word prevented. You see, what Sarah's doing right here is she's communicating to us how she believes God actually views her. And God absolutely views her in a way in her mind that she's unworthy. She's unworthy to actually have a child. She's unworthy to God, therefore she's unworthy to her husband, and she's even unworthy to her servant Hagar. And so she's wrestling with her self-worth. Have you ever done that before? The text wants you to notice a few things. It wants you to notice that Hagar is from Egypt. And how did she end up with Sarah and Abram? If you remember the story in Genesis chapter 12, we saw there's a huge famine. Abram headed to Egypt. He gave his wife to Pharaoh to protect himself. What a great husband, right? And in return, Pharaoh then gave him all these servants. And one of them would have been Hagar. But we can also notice that Hagar is described as a servant. In other words, she belongs to Sarai. She is her personal property. In fact, in this discussion, Hagar's not asked what she thinks or what she wants to be reality at all. She gets no say in the matter. She must do what Sarai tells her to do. So here's the thing. Sarai's plan, her scheme, is actually a very conventional idea in the day. You see, what would happen is if a woman was barren, she would give a servant to her husband that they could then have a child through. Here's the thing. Just because something's culturally acceptable today does not mean it's acceptable to God. You understand that? And so when you think about your own life, and you think about the way that you live and the decisions you make and what you do, the question is, are you filtering it through the Word of God? Because that dictates what we do. Culture does not decide what's right and wrong. God's Word has from the very beginning. And so we must be committed as believers in Jesus to that. So how does Abram respond then to this brilliant plan by Sarai? He shuts it down, right? We read the story. He said, "No, Sarah, this is a really bad plan. God's already promised me that he's going to come through for us. In fact, we're going to have a child. In fact, we're going to have a multitude of descendants. God's blessing us in such a way that's significant. We just simply have to wait for him in faith to come through on what he's promised us. Let's pray, Sarah." Is that what he says? No, it actually says that he listened to the voice of Sarai. So how did that conversation go? Oh, wait, you want me to have sex with a beautiful Egyptian young woman? Like, as my wife, you're okay with that? I mean, I guess it makes sense. I mean, in the culture, everyone's doing it. So therefore, it must be okay. Team on 3. This is a mess. Here's the crazy part in the story we read. Sarai actually thinks this is going to be a moral decision. She's choosing to do this in a moral way because what does she do? She wants Abram to marry Hagar. So it should not just happen on the side. No, you're going to marry her too. You're actually going to have 2 wives, Abram. It'll be okay. She was willing to share her own intimacy with her husband with another woman. Are you thinking about that, the reality of that? And so here we saw in Egypt in Genesis 12, Abram gave Sarai away. And here we see in Genesis 16, Sarai is giving Abram away. And the connection to Genesis 3 is so clear. In Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve, we saw that Eve saw the fruit, she took it, and she gave it to her husband. And here we see Sarai, she took Hagar and she gave her to her husband, Abram. In fact, the picture I have in my mind is the wedding day of Abram and Hagar. And Abram's waiting up front for his new bride to come down the aisle. And guess who's walking Hagar down the aisle? Sarai. Walking another woman down the aisle to give to her husband. This just doesn't actually make sense. And so what are the results of the scheming? We read it already, but we saw this, that Hagar was treated like a piece of meat. An instrument for Abram and Sarai's own glory, a soulless baby machine. And the result was what? Is that Hagar became pregnant, and she looked with contempt at Sarai. Now, the word contempt is kind of a weird word. It's actually a court word. And so here's what Hagar is doing. Hagar is looking at Sarai as if Sarai's unworthy and she's worthy. Hey, Hagar, or hey, Sarai, based on what you made me do, now that I'm pregnant, now that I'm having a baby, I just want you to know something. I'm better than you. You know what, Sarah? I'll take care of your husband. Since you can't give him what he needs, I, Hagar, the Egyptian, I will do it for you. Don't worry. It's going to be all right. The word contempt literally means is being unworthy because of an offense. Hey, Sarai, you're unworthy of your husband. So what does Sarah do? What would you do? She just thanks the Lord for the kindness of the situation. One commentator I read this week said this: she became volcanic. Think about that. That's human, right? She became volcanic. So here we have Sarai, this beautiful, barren, and bitter woman. She turns to her husband and wants to make it her husband problem. Here's the thing. Was this not her idea? Like, why are you yelling at your husband for something that you actually wanted? You see, Sarah has this love triangle, right? And now there's issues with her husband and there's issues with the other wife. Who would have thunk, you know? But here's the problem, and here's the truth. This is Abram's fault. Let me be clear. It's Abram's fault, just like it was Adam's fault. Abram is in charge. Abram is the one who was given the vision from the Lord, who's had the conversation with God that I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I just need you to be faithful. I need you to wait till my timing, because my timing is perfect. He's in charge. He's responsible. He's the leader of the house. God communicated to him directly, and Sarah then says, may the Lord judge between me and you. So she appealed to the Lord, who sees everything in secret. And here's what Abram should have said. He should have said, you know what, Sarah, you're right. I'm wrong. I should have shut this down. He should have taken his wife's side. He should have backed her up and said, I love you deeply. You are my wife. And he could have sought her forgiveness. But that's not what he does. Why? Because Abram is passive and he's pathetic. And he just removes responsibility from himself by telling Sarai, do with what your servant with what you want. I want you to see that phrase again. I want you to see it with your own eyes. In verse 6, Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Did you realize that Abram didn't even refer to Hagar as his wife? Let me back up. Did you notice in that response that Abram didn't even use her name? He wouldn't even say her name. He simply just called her your servant. And so here we have Hagar, who is actually she's unworthy to Abram. And she's going to be mistreated because it says in the next verse, that Sarai dealt harshly with her. And some people don't feel and realize that wasn't maybe physical abuse of any kind. It could have just been verbal. The problem with that in my world is that phrase is the exact phrase used in the book of Exodus with how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. It's so much easier to not care when you depersonalize those you abuse. And Sarah makes her pay. So let's talk about this love triangle. The first example in the Bible of a man being married to two women. It's absolutely imploded What do I mean by that? No one is treating anybody with dignity. And all this tension that exists here reveals that when you understand how God views you, it actually changes how you interact with others. And so if Sarah realized that she was found worthy in God's eyes, she would fully trust in God's promises. You see, what she believed was actually being prevented. But what is true is that God made a deliberate promise to her and to Abram. Hey, you understanding how God views you determines how this domino effect is going to play out. Let me be clear. No one here is worthy because of you. You're worthy because of Christ and what he's done for you, right? And so if you know him, that declares value and worth over your life. He knows every detail about you. He understands all that you've done, and he still says, I want relationship with you. And because that's reality, the beauty is this. God declares this. He declares value and worth over your life. But the choice you make is incredibly important. So what side of the domino effect are you on there? Let's go to the second one. Have you ever felt forgotten? Comparing domino effects here. The second is being found in or fleeing from God's sight. Look at the second part of verse 6 with me. We see that Sarah dealt harshly with her and she fled from her. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness and the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Wild text. So after she's mistreated, what does she do? It tells us that she actually runs. Here's what's wild to me. What do we not see happening? We don't see Sarai or Abram come after her. No one's pursuing her. They have zero concern about her. So here we have this woman who's been mistreated. She's been abused. She had no say in the matter. She's now fleeing from the pain. And where is she going? The answer is she's headed towards Egypt. She's trying to go home. She's trying to go where she's known. She's trying to go where she has value. But here's the problem with Egypt. Egypt is a godless place. So to abandon Canaan and head to Egypt is actually to leave the promise that God actually had for Abram, and God was going to bless them all together. But here's the question. If you were to ever run to a godless place, where do you choose to run? Where do you run? Because the pathway of compromise and sin, I don't think typically looks like it's that forbidden. And often when we want to run from something, we typically going to run to a place that we think is safe, but ultimately that place is ultimately dangerous. And so if sin is going to have its way in your life, where specifically does it actually lead you and take you? Because here's the thing, sin will never come through on its promises. So reading the story makes me question how we treat people. What kind of people are we? Because Hagar was so hurt by Abram and Sarah that what does she do? She actually runs. And did Abram run after his wife? No. Did Abram run after this woman then who's carrying his own child? The answer is no. Question, do you compel people towards Christ or do you repel people from Christ? Do you compel people to want to follow Christ, or do you repel people from the message of Jesus? Because how we treat people actually matters. How we interact with others matters. Ever messed up in your interaction with people before? And it didn't compel people towards Christ, it repelled them from Christ? I've never done that, so you know. 2 years ago, I was driving through the Costco parking lot, finding a parking spot. And I'm going down this lane, just looking for a parking spot, and this lady's driving an SUV coming across all the lanes, and she almost hits me. Luckily, no one hit anybody. She rolls her window down, I roll my window down. I'm about to say, it's okay. It's no big deal. Like, it's okay, right? And I thought for sure, she was like, I'm so sorry that I just wasn't paying attention. It's okay. It's really okay. Everyone's good. But that's not what she did. She rolls her window down and she starts ripping me a new one like it's my fault for driving down the normal lane. And she starts calling me all sorts of names and using all sorts of words that are 4 letters. Here's the problem for me. When that happens and I'm not at fault, man, sarcasm kicks in for me. And so I looked at the woman, I put my car in park, and I prayed for her, right? I said, may God bless you. That's actually not what I did, because that's not what I do when sarcasm kicks in. I said to her, oh, your husband must love that mouth, that potty mouth of yours. You're using that mouth to raise the next generation of children in your home? Wow, they're going to be a blessing to this world. Did I compel her towards Christ or repel her away from Christ? Let's not answer that. Ever been there before? Abram and Sarah don't have a heart for anybody but themselves here and their own plan. No one had a heart for Hagar. Here's the good news, church. God is on the search for the wanderer. God is on the search for the brokenhearted. And so what did the Lord do? He took the initiative. It says the angel of the Lord found her. Listen, have you ever had an encounter with Christ that truly changed everything? Like just one single encounter with him that changed everything in your life. Because here we have this pregnant woman who's been abused, who's on the run. She has no value, no worth, and she's absolutely unwanted. What do you think her posture was like, by the way? I think her face was defeated. I think her face was defeated. I think she's probably exhausted. And I think she's completely broken. And what does God do that Abram never would? God calls her by name, Hagar. Simply calling her name communicated value to her, to acknowledge who she is. And so God finds this hurting woman, and when God finds hurting people, he compels them towards himself, and he heals them. And so here's the good news for you. No matter the wound you have right now, it's never outside God's power to restore and heal it. And so God asks Hagar 2 important questions that we all need to wrestle with in the room. And those 2 questions are this: where are you from, and where are you going? Time for self-assessment. Where are you from? And where are you going? Now, when we talk about where you're from, here's what we mean. We mean, what's your story? What's the good, the bad, the ugly in your life? What are your greatest wins and your greatest failures? What are your best victories and your deepest wounds? Notice that she was honest with God about her wounds. God says, where are you going? And she says, I am running from Sarai, my mistress. I'm running away from her. And God knew her name, which means God knew her whole story, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual wounds that she had in her life. And it's almost like God was saying, hey, you know what? Abram didn't find you valuable enough to pursue you, but I, the Lord, do. And I am pursuing you. And so the second question is, where are you actually going? So here's the question for you. Where do your wounds actually lead you? When you're wounded, when you're hurt, when you've been rejected, when you're bitter, when you're frustrated, and when you're angry, where do you run? Where do those things compel you to go? Because here's what she's doing. She's running away from God's promise to a totally other place, headed back to the godless place of Egypt. What did God tell her to do? I want you to go back. I want you to go back to Abram. I want you to go back to Sarai. And here's what he said. I'm gonna multiply you, and I'm gonna give you many offspring. I'm gonna bless you in that way. And so what does she do? She actually heads back. But did you notice what God did and what he declared to her? God declared not only are you going to have a son, but he literally informed her of the gender, of the name, of the character, of the future of this child. You're going to have a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. By the way, Ishmael means God has heard. And why is that? Because the end of verse 11, where it says this, the Lord has listened to your affliction. Hey, church, when's the last time you took a moment to dump out your wounds to the Lord? To dump out your pain? To dump out all the things that have been hurting you and just tormenting you and just your sin and all these things that you are, and you just dumped it out on the Lord. Because here's what we see. When we do that, we know that God hears and God actually listens. It requires you to be honest. By the way, have you noticed that this scheme right here in Genesis 16, which seems like it's forever ago, why in the world would it matter today? This choice that Abram and Sarai made has significant ramifications in the world, even in 2023. Because Ishmael ends up settling in Assyria, which is modern-day Iraq. He fathers his own 12 tribes who go against the 12 tribes of Israel. And from the line of Ishmael comes all the Arab nations, including the religion of Islam. And so Ishmael, we've described here, is in constant conflict with everybody around him. And so this single decision right here in Genesis 16 has had a significant domino effect on everything happening in the world today. So what's the lesson? I think the lesson is this: shortcuts don't promote God's promises. And so we see Hagar, what does she do? She stops running and she starts trusting. Listen, when you encounter God like this with your deepest wounds and your greatest pains, typically how that will play out in your life is that you're going to stop running and you're going to start trusting. Okay, Hagar says, I'll go back to Abram. They've not treated me well, but she knows this, that God is with her, that God sees her, and that God's going to help and protect her. You see, the same God that Abram encountered is the same God that Hagar has encountered. The question is, have you actually encountered him? Have you ever felt forgotten? Comparing domino effects. Here's the third. Belonging to or breaking from God's vision. Look at verse 13 with me. It says, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer-lahai, and it lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Do you realize that Hagar recognizes something significant? Hagar recognizes that her knowledge of God is dependent on God actually knowing her. And so what is her response? You need to see her response. You are the God of seeing, she says. Like, you clearly see everything, and truly I have seen him who looks after me, is what she says. Listen, her whole life was laid bare before the Lord, and she's saying, God, you actually see me. You are a God who's actually for me. And what's interesting to me in her response is that she doesn't revel in the information about her son. She revels in who God actually is and who this God is that's revealed himself to her. And so she cherishes the Lord, the God who met her in her deepest wounds, in her most vulnerable moment. See, Hagar is saying this: God, you see me for who I am. And I'm so grateful for that, because no one else around me actually does. No one else around me speaks value to my life. No one else around me speaks worth into my life. You see me for who I am, God, and I'm so grateful for that. You see, no one in my life has any good plans for me, God, but you certainly do. So our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is that your greatest value is found in the God who sees you. Your value is found in the God who sees you. Listen, when you realize that God fully actually sees you, you can actually start to fully see him. And when you realize that God actually sees you, it actually speaks worth and value into your life, because what the result of that is they're actually found in him. And so when you're found in God, it plays out in such a beautiful way, because you end up being safe in God. And you embrace this vision that God actually has for your life. But the opposite is also true, church, the domino effects. That when you don't understand who God actually is, you can never actually understand who you are. You will not see God as he is. You'll never be found in God because of that. You won't have the worth that Jesus actually offers you. And so you're going to break away and you're going to flee and run in all your deep wounds from him. And so the question then is this: what changes when you know you're seen? What changes? When's the last time again that you've dumped out all your wounds before the Lord? For him to actually encounter you. A time of honesty. Where you look at all the things you've experienced in your life and you just lay it at his feet. Just the baggage, the weight, you being raw in that moment of the pain and the wounds. I'm sure you've been paying attention. All over social media is the talk of this revival happening at multiple universities around our country. And there's some that are skeptical of all that's happening, and there's some that have physically been there and have seen what seems to be the Spirit moving in the hearts of people. When I think about Hagar, and if I put myself in her shoes, I think about the truth of what is declared in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, where it says the first three words are this: if my people. If my people. If my people who are called by my name, if they humble themselves, if they pray, if they seek me, then I will forgive their sin. I'll forgive their wounds. I'll forgive their pain. I'll remove the baggage. I'll take the weight off their shoulders. And I will bless their land. But the verse that no one talks about is verse 15. And in this text, Solomon's the one who built the temple for the Lord. And so this is the Lord talking when he says, if my people. But the truth is now the temple is in us. The Holy Spirit's in us, and so the temple's actually right here. And so listen to what God says after he says that verse. In verse 15, he says this: now my eyes will be open. Good news for Hagar, right? I see you. You're seen by me. I see the wounds. I see the baggage. I see the hurt. I see the pain. For my eyes will be open, and my ears, God says, will be attentive to the prayer that is made in this place. Now, in this place is referring to the physical temple. But here's the truth. Again, the temple's right here. And so God is saying, my ears are open. My eyes are open. I will listen. If you cry out to me with a humble heart and attitude, and you're going to be honest about who you are and the pain that's happening in your life, I see you. I will engage with you. I will meet you. You will encounter me. And so my prayer for us this morning is, what if we just took a moment in our seat and we just put it all before the Lord? What are the wounds that you walked in here with this morning? What's the up and down of life that you're carrying right now? And you laid it all before the Lord, and you chose to honor him. You chose to seek him, to humble yourself before him. Because I just want to give you a moment in your seat to do that, just between you and the Lord. And then our worship team's Pastor Steve's gonna sing a song over us this morning. Okay, so let's take a moment in our seat right now and cry out to the Lord.